Good evening. Ethel Rogers here on behalf of the Conservation and Sustainability Committee and the Diversity Committee, co-sponsors of tonight's program with Monica Embrey, speaking about environmental justice. Ms. Embrey is the National Associate Director of the Beyond Dirty Fuels campaign. She oversees national campaigns in California calling for a just transition in managing the decline of the oil and gas industry, and works with the state and local coalitions to build power for climate justice objectives. She has over 15 years of experience leading environmental and social justice causes on local, regional, and national levels, developing strategic campaigns and coordinating and managing interdepartmental teams and staff through justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. She formerly worked with California Calls, Greenpeace USA, and Green Corps Fellowships. Ms. Embrey is a 2009 graduate of Pomona College with a BA in Environmental Analysis with a focus on race, class, and gender, and a minor in Women's Studies. After her presentation, Ms. Embrey will answer questions from our panelists, Helen Hines, John Townsend, and Bob Tranquata. And Gardens residents are encouraged to text or telephone questions to 602-828-3694. I'm delighted to welcome Monica Embrey.
Thank you so much, Ethel, and thank you everyone for having me tonight. I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation specifically about intersectional environmental justice. And so that is the theme for this evening. So you may be wondering, first, who is this person that's talking with you tonight? So I want to introduce myself. And this is here actually a photograph of my grandmother. Her name was Sue Kunitomi Embrey. And when she was 18 years old, she was told to pack everything she owned and put it in suitcases to go to an unknown place for an unknown amount of time. And the year was 1942, and the federal government and FDR had just signed Executive Order 9066, which called for the incarceration of all people of Japanese ancestry. And so my grandmother spent a year of her life behind barbed wire at this place called Manzanar. And this had significant impacts, of course, not just on her life, but also mine, as I grew up as a little girl watching her fight for justice. She decided to speak out against the injustices that she and our family and friends had endured and call on the federal government to institute reparations as well as restoration. Part of that included declaring Manzanar a National Historic Site as part of our National Parks program. And so the photo you actually see behind me is of Manzanar today. So needless to say, my grandmother was my hero, and so I decided to come to California to go to college and be close to her. As Ethel mentioned, I went to Pomona College, and I studied environmental analysis with a focus on race, class, gender, and the environment. And while at Pomona, during my first year, my grandmother ended up falling sick and passing away. And this was a pretty heartbreaking moment for me, and I really struggled to think about continuing at school or returning home to Chicago. And in thanks to the brilliance of support of my mentors and professors, including Tar Miller and Phyllis Jackson, I decided to stay at Pomona and really study and understand what had happened to my grandmother, what had caused her to fall ill and take away her life years too soon. And so that's part of what I ended up studying and really understanding. Why do some communities get disproportionate impacts to air pollution, which cause health problems and make a multitude of different issues, including premature death, like had happened to my grandmother? And more importantly, what could I do to make a difference so that no one was going to lose their family or friends too soon? And so I then spent the last 15 years organizing, writing, and advocating for environmental justice. I've moved all across the country, worked on campaigns in Illinois and Michigan and Indiana, in North Carolina and Florida, and also here in California. And I'm also a published author in a book actually edited by Tar Miller called The Nature of Hope, where I write extensively about the ways in which local communities can come together and make a difference, and the ways that we do that work really matter. And so it's been my privilege to be able to do this work as a professional activist, and currently I'm doing that here in Los Angeles with the Sierra Club. So tonight I'm going to cover a few different topics. First, I want to take some time to define some terminology, because intersectional environmental justice is an emerging field, and being clear about the terms we're using will be really helpful for our conversation. Then I'm going to go into a history lesson. It's a brief, short history of the historical context of both the mainstream conservation movement as well as environmental justice movement. I'm going to talk about the current scope of our crisis, and in fact, intersecting crises, and really think about why environmentalists must embrace an intersectional approach if we are to be successful, and the tools that we can use for how to do that work. So to begin, intersectionality. It became one of the top words of the year in 2015, but is actually a concept that was introduced in 1989 by Kimberly Crenshaw. She's an attorney who's been working for years to advocate at the front lines of this issue. And so quite simply, intersectionality is an approach. It looks at the ways and complex and cumulative ways in which multiple forms of discrimination, like racism, sexism, and classism, combine, overlap, and intersect, and how those especially impact marginalized individuals and groups. And when she was introducing this concept in 1989, she was often thinking about the ways in which inequalities persist, and how categories like gender and race and class are best understood as overlapping and mutually constitutive rather than isolated and distinct. At the same moment, I am a woman, I am multiracial, in part Japanese American and white, and I'm an upper middle class person. I'm not any of those things separately. I'm all of those things at the same time. And that's part of what intersectionality calls on us to understand. And then that's also applied, of course, to our laws, to our justice system, to who and how get impacted by different issues. As Audre Lorde, activist and poet, says, there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issued lives. Really calling us to think about how do the issues we face connect, and what are the ways in which they're mutually constructive. Then we have a term, environmental justice. So this is a term that has gained popularity mostly since the 80s, and the EPA actually has formed an Office of Environmental Justice and defines it as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, natural origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So again, how do these varying identities and issues intersect in relationship to our environment? Who gets to breathe the clean air? Who gets access to clean water? Who gets the resources like access to open wild spaces? All of those are issues of environmental justice. So when addressing intersectional environmental justice, what we're really looking at is the fact that the issues that cause those harms on the environment and our people are connected. And therefore, the solutions to them must also be connected. And so really, it's the call and the belief that those intersecting oppressions are interlinked and cannot be solved alone. We will not solve our climate crisis unless we also deal with issues of racism, sexism, and classism. So now I'm going to transition and talk about the conservation movement and talk a little bit about the history of the mainstream conservation movement and then how that has impacted where we are today. So folks might recognize Teddy Roosevelt and John Muir, definitely known as two of the founders of the conservation movement, wrote extensively and really helped shape a ton of our thinking and current environmental policy. John Muir is one of the founders of the Sierra Club, the organization that I work for today. Folks might not be as familiar with Madison Grant, who was also a founding member of the conservation movement. He was also a very active white supremacist. In 1916, Madison Grant published a book called The Passing of the Great Race, or The Racial Basis of European History. It was a pseudoscience work that really exemplified white supremacist norms and sounded the alarm around the decline of the Nordic peoples. This text was referred to by Hitler as his Bible. And so when you think about these conservationists in the late 1800s who were working for this, it's really important that we think about the ways in which they were doing their work and their conservation work. And there's an incredible Professor Purdy who studies environmentalism's racist history. And in it, he really calls on us to understand how the architects of our country's environmental parks and games and refuge were really only working to protect wildlife for the worthy. They were looking at the aristocratic qualities. And when those were lacking, these folks were indifferent. So we often heard Roosevelt talk about how lordly and noble the elk and buffalo were, that they loved to hunt. And so their concept of preservation was really rooted in the idea that they wanted to continue to allow these types of interactions between the would-be aristocratic men and that halfway wild nature, really allowing places for those aristocratic folks to be able to enjoy and hunt. But there was an issue when they were looking at doing this, because the lands which they were coming across, the Southern Sierran, were occupied and were home to many people, including the Miwok and Ahwahnechee peoples. And so as they were encountering the beautiful places like Yosemite, they also encountered indigenous communities. And the words and language they use to describe these communities is quite telling. So here are words published in John Muir's essays used to describe the Native Americans he encountered. He described their grossness, that they were mostly ugly, and some of them altogether hideous. A strangely dirty and irregular life these dark-eyed, dark-haired, half-happy savages lead in this clean wilderness. He said of one woman he encountered, "In every way, she seems sadly unlike nature's neat, well-dressed animals, though living like them on the bounty of the wilderness. Strange that mankind alone is dirty." And he even said they were another species altogether. The Indian kept in the background, never saying a word. So when Teddy Roosevelt and John Muir set out to Yellowstone to help form the first national park as part of our National Park Service, one of the critical components to creating a wilderness without people was the forced removal of those First Nations people from their land, people who had been living in this area for time immemorial. There are over 26 tribes today that are currently connected to the grounds that are Yellowstone. And this is important to understand that this was not actually the first concept of our park system. So a painter, George Catlin, wrote in 1841 the concept of a national park that could contain man and beast in all the wild and really looking at this connection, right? The freshness of their nature's beauty. He was envisioning a park that would allow people and nature to coexist. But John Muir had a really different idea of that. And in 1888, he wrote that of the Yosemite Valley Mono Indians he encountered, that they seemed to have no right place in the landscape. I was glad to see them fading out of sight down the path. So these are very different concepts of how to preserve our parks and what are the ways in which we do that. And as Professor Cantor wrote, and really looking at the ethnic cleansing in Americans' creation of the national parks, that the environmentalists and writers of this time conceived of people and nature as very separate, perhaps even fundamentally incompatible. This concept that it's people over nature, and that not even all people are over, right? That actually native and indigenous peoples are under nature. This is a very white supremacist concept, and actually one that really originated with the conservation movement in the United States. And so this was repeated again, right? John Muir helped publish a book called Our National Parks, which was really a collection of essays intended to promote park tourism. This text was written directly for aristocratic upper middle class white families to be able to come enjoy. And what he wrote was he assured readers that, as to Indians, most of them are dead or civilized into useless innocence. In that same paragraph, though, he described bears as poor fellows that have been poisoned, trapped, and shot at. And so the ways in which he is uplifting animals and nature and conservation while putting down indigenous peoples cannot be understated. This had magnificent impacts on our conservation movement and how we frame and think about the work that we do even today. It's also not enough to simply excuse this as the racism of the time. Again, that Professor Purdy explains that Muir and his followers are remembered because of their respect for non-human life and wild places. What does it mean that they cared more about the animal people than about their fellow human beings? The context of the day might be part of an explanation, but by no means is it an excuse. We are talking about a time in U.S. history after the end of slavery where there's a massive Reconstruction movement, where there were more people of African ancestry, more Black people in our federal Congress than there are today. This is a moment in time when we were talking about racial justice issues. It was a major issue on the forefront of people's lives. It is not enough to say that's how things were back then. So as I mentioned, this continued its influence, right? We see multiple texts in the late 1940s, looking at the road to survival and our plundered planet, really talking about the ways in which we need to consider things like population control because there were too many people of color. That again continued in 1968 with the population bomb concept, right? Really focusing on the fact that there were too many people, as opposed to actually looking at which people are actually using the most resource extraction and taking that into consideration. You'll see from this Time magazine cover that it's predominantly people of color, right? African American, Black, Latino, Asian American, Indigenous people that are the ones as being seen as having too many people, where it is far often those of us in the first world, in the United States and Europe, and overwhelming those of us who are in the highest socioeconomic classes that are using the most resources and causing the demise of our planet. And so who gets to have children and what that concept is really actually rooted in the theories and ideologies that Madison Grant and others put forward about the Nordic races falling to decline. We can see a direct link between those different types of ideologies. And this has continued to have impacts into the contemporary environmental movement. And that's why for far too long, the mainstream environmental movement has been historically white and upper middle class. We can see that in my own organization. In 1972, the Sierra Club polled our membership. And even the framing of the question in this poll actually is quite iterative and explains a bit. The question read, should it concern itself with the conservation problems of such special groups as the urban poor and ethnic minorities? The fact that conservation issues for people of color were seen as special and outside the mainstream is written into the question. Only 15% of Sierra Club members in 1972 who responded to this poll were supportive, and 40% were strongly opposed. So now I'm going to talk a little bit instead about the environmental justice movement, which has a different and distinct history than the mainstream environmental movement. Environmental justice movement is the cry of defiance against the onslaught of oppressive toxins and toxic oppressants that threaten to submerge our homes. As artist Ricardo Levin Morales explains, it really is going back to that intersecting thought of how do race and class and gender and other identities impact who gets to breathe the clean air and clean water and who does not. So one of my favorite things in this context to do is talk about founding environmentalists that we don't often consider. And Harriet Tubman is actually one that Brenton Mock highlights, and I really appreciate. We only usually think of her as someone in regards to racial justice. But in order for her to have been successful at navigating the landscape and actually helping lead in the military efforts, she had to have a knowledge very steeped in environment and ecology. She was very well versed in the terrain and could understand things that many of us today do not know about our natural surroundings. Also, we should look to people like W.E.B. Du Bois and look at the way that he studied at the same time that we are talking about Madison Grant and Teddy Roosevelt and John Muir writing, how he wrote a study of Philadelphia looking at the housing and health conditions of African Americans. While it is a sociological study, it's also an environmental study. He considers the environmental conditions that communities were facing and links that to social inequity and justice issues. That is the definition of environmental justice. And of course, we have our current modern day founder of the environmental justice movement, Dr. Bob Bullard. And Mr. Bullard has published over 18 books looking at environmental justice, embracing the principle that all people have the right to protection and equal enforcement of environmental laws. And so looking at a brief history of how Dr. Bullard and others have really modernized this concept, there was a major toxic crisis, as we saw from Love Canal and Cancer Alley, where communities, especially communities of color, were becoming the dumping grounds for our country. These areas have far too long been considered sacrifice zones. One of those fights came to a head in Warren County, North Carolina, where a predominantly African American community was about to get dumped tons of pounds of PCBs, those toxic chemicals, from neighboring white communities. That the white counties were going to truck in their pollution to this historically Black community. It raised such a fight that many people took direct action, as you can see here, literally laying their bodies on the street to try and prevent the trucks from coming in and poisoning their water supply. Ultimately, they were unsuccessful in this fight, and one of the largest PCB dumping sites was developed in this Black neighborhood. Part of what happened, though, is reports, including this one, the first ever report that linked toxic waste and race, was published. And the studies started linking the disproportionate impact that communities of color were facing from environmental pollution. So as we look at these intersecting crises, we must also consider that they need intersectional solutions. Again, when we look at the facts today, there are disproportionate impacts where communities of color are far closer to fossil fuel infrastructure. About 68% of African Americans and 40% of Latinos live within 30 miles of a coal-fired power plant. And this photograph is actually of Wilmington here in Southern California. We see tons of oil and gas infrastructure directly into communities' backyards. When you're closer to fossil fuel infrastructure, that means you are breathing in more toxic air. Overall, communities of color breathe nearly 40% more polluted air than white communities. And when you breathe in toxic air, that means you have more health impacts. Health impacts like asthma, preterm birth, low birth weight, cancer, and premature death are rampant in communities of color. And that's in part because of the disproportionate impacts from those infrastructure. Of course, these issues are not just limited to race. We have to think about the way that class is in part of this, and poverty. When people have less access to disposable income, that means they have less resources to handle a crisis, less money to take off a day to be sick or go to a doctor, less resources to be able to take care of those opportunities, less opportunity to move your home if you are living in a community that you realize is poisoning you. Again, these issues compound and intersect with other issues like workplace hazards, immigration status, and language. If you don't have the language to be able to go see a healthcare professional or understand the signs that are posted in your neighborhood about the dangers of the oil well next door, what about the cultural and education barriers that also come into play here? And of course, many immigrants especially are disproportionately impacted by the work that they do in agriculture, landscaping, and construction, facing many more toxins and risks. There's been a lot of accountability within our movements. So in 1990, environmental justice organizations wrote a letter to the 10 largest predominantly white-led environmental groups, asking for clear steps to consider the issues around people of color and how those are disproportionate, and the focus only on white-based conservationism was in fact environmental racism. And what's fascinating is sometimes I hear the myth that people of color don't care about these issues. And the fact is the polling shows that could not be more false. Communities of color have always polled higher than white communities at caring about issues of climate change, among other environmental issues. And we've seen this. It's clear as to why. When we see the crises that happen, like what happened in Hurricane Katrina, or Hurricane Sandy, or Flint, Michigan, communities of color are bearing the brunt of these harms, and so very much care about the solutions we need. So to end, how do we do environmental justice, intersectional environmental justice at that? One of my favorite sayings that came out of the People's Climate March is, to change everything, it takes everyone. So we need to lean into the intersections and not competition. It is about finding the ways that these issues connect. It's not that one issue is more important than another. To the biologist working to save the habitat for a frog species that's going out extinct, that is the most important issue. For the mother who's working to make sure that her child can be fed, that is the most important issue. For the community that's fighting for clean air so that their children can continue to breathe, that is the most important issue for that community. So instead of competition, we must see those intersections and build upon each other. There is no need for an oppression Olympics or an issue Olympics. We need to all come together to fight for what we need. And there are some guiding principles on how to do this. The environmental justice movement has provided two foundational documents. One is the Hames Principles that guides how we should do this work together. And the second is the Principles of Environmental Justice, which focuses on the types of issues that we need to take into consideration as we do our work. And finally, we also need to consider, what is this just transition? To change everything, we need everyone, and we need an entire system change. So how do we leave an extractive economy based on our military, on fossil fuels, and the concentration of wealth and power into the few, to instead invest in a regenerative economy where everyone has access to safe, stable, and affordable housing, jobs that make us be able to maintain our livelihoods, clean energy, and climate resilience. And I will end with this quote, which is that, if you have come to help me, you are wasting your time. But you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine. Then let us work together. Credited to Aboriginal activists in Australia. Thank you for having me here tonight to talk about this issue.
Thank you, Monica. And now we'll take questions from our panel. We have Helen Hines and John Townsend here. And Helen, have you got a question you'd like to start with?
Yes. Thank you, Monica. This was really very well done, I think. I don't know nearly as much as you about environmental issues in general. My question, though, regards this idea of cultural and language barriers. Theoretically, I think you've seen problems very clearly, but on a practical level, are you working with an organization that does anything to teach young minority students things that they can do to get involved with financial activities that will have a positive effect on the environment and a positive effect on their own banking accounts? Realistically, what can you do to teach young Black, Hispanic kids things that they can do that will enrich them financially while helping the environment at the same time?
Thank you, Helen. I absolutely appreciate this question, and you've hit it exactly on the head, right? it has to work for our economy and for our environment and our communities. And so part of what the Sierra Club and my work has included recently is really advocating for at the policy level and doing that work directly with communities on a just transition. And I'll speak to that because that's another term I could have put a slide on to define. It is an emerging and ever-changing concept today. But essentially, we know we need to leave the fossil fuel economy and transition to a clean energy economy. Doing that is necessary for our climate. But unless we do that in a way that's rooted in equity and justice, we will be reifying the same systems that we've always had. So part of what that work looks like is making sure that the communities who have been hit and impacted the worst by environmental pollution because of environmental racism, exactly as you said, especially here in Southern California, that includes Black, Latino, and Asian American communities, are able to get the jobs in the clean energy transition that we need. So at the County of Los Angeles, I sit on a countywide task force that's specifically looking at just transition jobs and opportunities. One of the subsets of that is, can we actually put people to work to clean up the brownfields, to clean up the toxic infrastructure in communities, and then revitalize those places depending on what the community determines they need. And so we've been working to actually scope out with LA County right now, what are the job prospects and how can we make sure those jobs are good jobs, family sustaining wages with benefits, pensions, retirement packages. We don't need to put people into poverty cleaning up this toxic waste. They deserve to be compensated fairly, and it would be a benefit for our environment and our health. And then, of course, to help revitalize those places so that we don't have toxic infrastructure in our backyards, but instead parks, hospitals, shopping centers, renewable energy, whatever the community determines it needs.
Thank you, Helen, and thank you, Monica. How about you, John?
Hi, Monica. I've got a couple of questions. I'll start with one. You're talking about sort of reducing, potentially eliminating fossil fuels. And I've been worrying a lot about climate change and the impact of putting so much carbon up in the atmosphere. And I've seen it described as sort of, and maybe it's the analog of the 5 stages of grief, in which there are 3 stages here. First is mitigation, second is adaptation, and the third is suffering. And this is where I presume the social environmental justice issues come in. And it seems that almost in any way that people try to frame this, it looks like the suffering is not being shared uniformly. And within certain countries, they get hurt much more than others. And within a country, it looks like certain groups of individuals, as you were suggesting, are most likely to be damaged by this. Is that a fair way to think about this problem?
I think that is exactly right. And I really appreciate you also naming the global context of which this evolves, right? We know that many countries are not getting the same impacts as others. And so the ways in which those countries, especially across the globe, and generally speaking, the global south in Africa and Asia and Latin America, are getting pummeled by climate change, and how those nations have less resources to be able to deal with that. That third concept of suffering, I think, is a really important one. And what intersectional environmental justice calls on us to do is to mitigate that harm. How can we reduce the suffering that is inevitable? And often people ask me, how do we stop climate change? And part of what my answer is that, well, climate change is here. We are currently seeing the impacts of the climate crisis. To me, the question isn't how do we stop it, it's how do we mitigate those harms, and how do we make communities more adaptive and resilient to them, and lessen that third characteristic of suffering that you named. That is what all of us must continue to work together to do.
Thank you.
I have something here for you, Monica, from Jan Bush. She says, I appreciate your honest telling of our conservation history. It is a deeply troubling one. My question, the pandemic exposed the large disparities that minorities and working class suffer right here in LA County. Latinos are 3 times as likely to die from COVID as whites. Blacks are twice as likely to die. Their susceptibility to harm is linked to polluted neighborhoods, at least partly. How hopeful are you that we Angelenos can create the political will to bring clean economy to everyone?
Jan, I also love this question because you named it. It is about political will. So I want to just first name on that part of your question and then tell you why I am hopeful. And it's not just because I have the privilege of doing this every day for my job, but I want to share some insights into what I get to see that I know not everyone does. This is a question of political will. We actually have the science and technology and tools. And of course, those innovations will continue to develop, but we already have what we need in order to transition from this extractive fossil fuel economy to the clean regenerative economy. That we have the technology. Far too often we get to blame it on not having enough. That's not true. We know that the wind and solar and battery storage combined with energy efficiency can power all of our homes, can power our transportation system, can power our economy. So in terms of this question of political will, it's a tough one. I'm going to start with the hard challenges, which is that there are absolutely significant forces who are opposed to this transition. They are the fossil fuel industry, perhaps the largest companies in the world. You've got Exxon and Shell and BP and Mobil and oil majors and their lobbyists at the state level. We've got the Western States Petroleum Administration and many others who advocate at our local government, our state government, our federal government against the common sense protections that we need. Part of what keeps me hopeful is that while they have money, and trust me, the Sierra Club may be a large organization, but is far outspent in every capacity compared to what the fossil fuel industry spends in advocating for their policies. We have people, and it is a question of political will. And what gives me incredible hope is the consciousness that is being continually raised. When I went to college in 2005, 2009, I remember being asked by my grandmother why I was going to study environmentalism. This is not my grandmother that passed away, but my other grandmother on my mom's side. She had no idea why I would focus on the environment. And in a mere decade, mere 15 years since then, we've completely changed how we understand the issue of climate crisis, how we understand the issue of white supremacy and racism. Our country is waking up, and that means our politicians will follow. Change is very slow, and then it can be very fast. And so I feel really hopeful. I actually feel the most hopeful at our local level. The LA County Board of Supervisors is currently run by 5 incredibly powerful women, and the one who just got most recently elected is perhaps one of the strongest environmental justice advocates in the state. Former Senator, now Supervisor Holly Mitchell, is an incredible champion for environmental justice and is willing to stick her neck out. Twice while in the state legislature, she introduced bills to ban fracking, taking a stance against the fossil fuel industry in California. And while both of those bills failed, we have another one we are fighting for this year. And Holly Mitchell genuinely understands the concerns of women and communities of color. She's most famous, perhaps, for her leadership around the Crown Act, a state bill that made it illegal to discriminate based on hair. And that was a major, major win, especially for African-American women who were facing incredible discrimination at the workplace and many other settings because of hair. And now that is illegal thanks to her leadership. And so having someone in our LA County supervisors who gets it and is with us makes me really hopeful about what we can accomplish in the next coming years.
Perfect. Thank you. Helen, do you have another question?
Yes. Monica, in terms of the large industries, the fossil fuel industry, how can that be in some way, is there some way to oppose big oil or big gas by getting minority communities involved in producing and selling biofuels. I know they'll never be able to do it on that large scale as these large industries, but you have actual examples of communities or minority groups that are producing and selling biofuels.
Biofuels specifically, I don't. And actually, often is a pretty challenging topic within the environmental movement because while there are sometimes seen as benefits, there are other harms depending on how biofuels are sourced. So I don't know about biofuels specifically, but the heart of your question, which is how do we get communities of color to be directly invested in that transition, is exactly what I think is critical and right. I remember when I worked and lived in North Carolina, one of the biggest efforts actually was getting African Americans actively involved in solar energy. And North Carolina is actually second in the country to California for its production of solar, or it was when I was there. I don't actually know the data today. And in part, that was because of a really concerted effort to get Black farmers to install solar panels on their farms. And as our agriculture system was, really struggling, it was a great way that farmers could keep their land and keep their livelihoods by actually having solar companies come and install solar panels. And so the heart of what you are saying is exactly it. How do we make sure that the communities who have been far too left behind are the ones actually getting to drive this change? And that actually goes back to Jan's question. It is a question of political will, right? It is inevitable unless we are intentional about this transition and intentional about who's going to benefit. The dominant system, which right now in this country continues to be racism, will continue to manifest. So we must be very proactive and actually pass laws and policies and regulations that ensure our transition is a just one. Otherwise, it will not be just.
We have a question here from, I think it was Joe Beckwith. So let me see if I can find it. Okay, what steps could be taken by residents of our community to contribute to solving these problems? Great.
Thanks, great question. So I think I always ask folks to take action both at an individual level, a community level, and then a political level, because the truth is it is going to take all of us doing a lot to make the differences that we need. So on the individual level, I think the most common sense actions that many people take often are doing audits of your home energy uses and really making sure that you're maximizing the local use. It's great for our pocketbooks as well. So ensuring that within your community, right, you've got the best energy efficient windows and light bulbs and infrastructure makes a really big difference. And as a community, not only doing that one person at a time, but actually collectively doing that is part of what's really helpful to make the whole difference on the fossil fuel impact and footprint that people take. There's also a really big need, though, for communities to come together and advocate for the policies and changes we need at the political level. And so encouraging whatever different issues, and there are many that connect into this issue of the climate crisis and intersectional environmental justice, whether it's advocating right now, LA is looking at going to 100% renewable energy. And we are excited about pushing that forward. We're going to need everyday people from all across LA to be calling in to advocate for that path to happen. At our state level, there are really important bills, and your legislators need to hear from you. And so the easiest way that I find for folks to get involved in a political level is to join an organization, to be with others, to really collectively make a difference. Because when one person makes a phone call, it might get heard. When 2 people make phone calls, it starts raising attention. And when we get entire communities and groups to raise our voices, that is when we overpower the dollars of big oil, and when everyday people can actually make the difference and make sure our decision makers are passing the laws that we need. And the other side of that political thesis is to vote and to make sure the people we get into office are representing our needs. Because it's really hard to convince someone who was elected on fossil fuel money to vote for us and our concerns. And so we have to get champions like Supervisor Holly Mitchell into office. She ran against a pro-oil, oil-backed opponent and swept the election. So it is possible when we come together to actually elect our champions. And that's part of what it's all of us' jobs to do.
Thank you. How about you, John? Have you got another question for Monica?
Yeah, I'd like to sort of come back to what I said initially, in which these 3 sort of prongs of dealing with climate change, mitigation, adaptation, and suffering. I'm really interested in minimizing the suffering part, and therefore things that we can do that will mitigate the damage that's being caused by burning fossil fuels sort of really gets my attention. And you're part of this. I'm going to ask you, maybe controversial. Let me give an example of what I heard recently, is that Germany was actually a leader in sort of using photovoltaics, even though their climate doesn't necessarily fit as well to doing that as probably much of the United States. Nonetheless, they got scared about using nuclear power and basically were shutting down their nuclear power plants and replacing them with coal-powered plants, which is not a winning strategy. And Bill Gates, as you probably know, has a book out, which is in the Gardens Library right now. You'll get there once the carpeting is replaced, if any of you want to check it out. And he's arguing that in making this transition to a carbon-free environment, we're not going to succeed if we go shutting down the nuclear power plants that we have. We need to keep using them, and ideally even putting up more of them that are safer and not as potentially fraught with some of the dangers that the early power plants had. And I'm curious, as a member of the Sierra Club, how do you react to that?
Oh, I definitely appreciate the advocacy that Bill Gates is doing on this. Part of the risks and the part of how I approach our energy systems and our energy crisis really is around this question of the suffering and the harms. And the risks that come from nuclear power plants include the tens of thousands of years of the half-life of the nuclear waste. And there are massive fights. I don't know how they're unfolding in Germany, but here in the United States, the way that that waste disposal process is unfolding is very much an issue of environmental racism and environmental justice, where Native communities and sacred sites are becoming the dumping zones for nuclear waste. And the incredible injustice within that, where communities who have been in Native and First Peoples who have been on a land for time immemorial, for tens of thousands of years, are now being faced with waste for the next tens of thousands of years. Waste they have not often benefited from, as many people within those communities actually still don't even have access to electricity or clean drinking water or other environmental resources is part of that. So the other main factor that I think is really important to consider is the cost. And to build a nuclear power plant, the billions of dollars of those investments, as opposed to retrofitting homes, like I was just actually suggesting on the individual change level, and putting millions of people to work to make sure all of our homes are completely retrofitted and not leaking energy, to make sure that we could have solar panels on every single available roof, that we could have solar community gardens where people actually, going back to part of Helen's concept of this economic benefit, where people could actually buy in and invest in a community garden at whatever economic level they are able to as an economic investment. When we think about wind, which did continue to power Texas and does work in our frozen areas, I think we really need to focus on the solutions like efficiency, renewables, as the ways to invest. And I think those dollars spent will create much more safety, justice, and economic benefit, actually, for workers. And so that's more of the solutions that we are calling for today to deal with the climate crisis and power our homes and schools and everything else.
Thank you.
Okay, now if Helen and John have no more questions, do you have another question, Helen?
I wanted to ask about young people again at the college level or even at the high school level. Have you actually seen, Monica, for example, in the Asian community, and I really appreciate your speaking about your grandmother because I have great affection in my own heart for my own grandmother. Grandmothers are great. Have you tried to bring, not you personally, but your organization, have you tried to bring environmental issues into focus into very wealthy Asian communities? For example, a community like, I don't know, Arcadia, close to Pasadena. Very, very wealthy. But is there an environmental consciousness as far as you know?
So yes, part of what Sierra Club is most known for, in part because of how we founded, is as an outings organization. And here in Southern California, pre-pandemic days, we would have hikes and outings, multiple a day across the LA region. We would actually have thousands of hikes. And part of the work that we do is actually to bring communities who do not typically engage or don't have access to nature and outdoor spaces to those places. And one of the main efforts we've done here in Southern California is within the San Gabriel Mountains.
Very good.
And what we've actually helped advocate for is free public transportation from communities in the San Gabriel Valley to the San Gabriel Mountains.
Wonderful.
And so making sure that communities, Asian American communities especially, have access to the transportation to be able to then go enjoy those. And so that it's not dependent only on people who have a car or a driver's license to be able to participate. Part of why public transportation is such a critical component to that is, of course, that'll help reduce overall climate emissions from traffic, from vehicles, but also which communities use public transportation. If someone happens to be an undocumented immigrant and for varying reasons doesn't have a driver's license, then that person isn't going to be able to get to those places. So allowing public transportation to increase access across class, across immigration status, across race is one critical way that we try directly to engage in that. We also have an entire program dedicated to young people, and we call it the Sierra Student Coalition. And we actively engage in high schools and colleges across California and across the country, plugging into classrooms, doing education and engagement. I actually speak at colleges and high schools a couple of times, at least a semester, which has been really, I love having those conversations and really thinking about how do we get communities plugged in. And then the last thing I'll share is at the Sierra Club, we also do really intentional development of young people. And which colleges we reach out to really matters. So right now, we're doing a really intentional drive within the community college system and actually developing an internship program with West LA Community College so that people of all different education backgrounds are able to help participate and engage in artwork. As a deep commitment, again, to that equity and justice principle. I was really fortunate to be able to go to Pomona College. Not everyone is. And so how do we open it up to all schools and make sure that everyone is able to participate is really important.
Wonderful.
Well, Monica, many thanks for sharing your expertise with us, and we're so glad you could join us, and you don't even have to drive home. And we wish you every success in your work toward this environmental justice issue. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'll be sure to share the presentation. I also have additional resources. Anyone is interested to learn more, there's a lot of really great text out there, and appreciate so much the time and space to have this conversation tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you.